So welcome to Brown Bag History for February 1st, 2023. It's hard to believe, A, that it's 2023 and B, that it's February already. So today we're going to, before we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snipes territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, or Silks, and the Tanaha to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So today we're talking about place names, and just wanted to start with a quote from Shelley Boyd, who is the liaison for the Sinixt Arrow Lakes tribe of the Colville Confederated Tribes. And she said, to us, the rivers, mountains, and other parts of the natural world are not just dirt, rocks, and trees without life. They breathe, they feel, and they speak. These places are living entities, and the names we give them reflect the spirit of the land. So it's a good thing to think about as we talk about the names. As Shelley has pointed out, Europeans tend to like to name things after people, and their names reflect sort of what those places meant to them or how they interacted with those places. So they did have a village in the Big Eddy that was known as Skuhikin, and I don't know what that means. I haven't heard the translation of that one yet. But their name for the Columbia River, Sinwentuquitku, means spirit or swift river. That's the name of the book that Laura Stovall wrote about the history of the Columbia River and in this region. And of course, the Columbia River, the name that we know it by, was given by a Captain Gray, who came into the mouth of the Columbia River and named it after his ship, which was called the Columbia Rediviva. So it still bears that name. So the original name of the town site in this area, of course, was Farwell, and it was named after Arthur Stanhope Farwell. And he was a provincial surveyor. He had come to Victoria from England in 1864. And at one point, he was actually appointed provincial surveyor. He was actually in this area in the 1870s doing some survey work as part of Walter Moberly's surveying in this region. And so when the rail line was coming through, he knew exactly where it was going to go. He knew where the line was coming through, and he was trying to do kind of an end run around the CPR because he knew this would end up as part of the railway belt, which was an agreement with the Dominion government, whereby they were granting a lot of the available land to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. So his idea was that he got here first. He applied for his land grant to the provincial government because this land, the CPR survey plan, hadn't been filed yet, so it wasn't officially part of the railway belt, but he knew that it was going to be. So he applied for a provincial grant, laid out his town site. He surveyed it himself. He actually had more than just the town site. He actually had his land grant was actually 20 miles in length and 4 miles in depth. So it was really considerable land. It included most of what's most of what is Revelstoke now, except for sort of where the station area is and the other side of Mackenzie Avenue. It also included most of Columbia Park. So very considerable holdings here. And so there he laid out his town site. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the specific street names, but we've got John, James, and George Street show up on this map. They're now 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street. Douglas was possibly after James Douglas, the first governor of British Columbia, but we're not positive about that. Some of the others I'll talk about a little later in the talk, but So that's the town site. It was originally called Second Crossing because this was the second time that the railway line crossed the Columbia River, starting from the east. So first at Donald, and then the second, or near Golden, and the second crossing was here. So we ended up going from Farwell to Revelstoke. And this is who we're named after. He's a British lord who never set foot here, but he was the first Baron Revelstoke. He was brought it into the peerage as a result of his work in the banking sector. His family they'd started out as wool merchants and ended up with, as a result of doing trading, they ended up establishing a bank in England. It was actually one of the biggest banks, and they did a lot of international trade, including financing the Louisiana Purchase in the United States. So when the CPR was at a point where they were having trouble paying their workers and they were practically bankrupt with the construction of the railway, they sent George Stephen, the head of the company, to England looking for backers. And they had this issue of stock that they needed to find a buyer for. And Barings Bank purchased most of that issue of stock and basically saved the company. So obviously, they wanted to reward him, and the Van Horn, who was William Van Horn, who was the vice president of the CPR at the time, actually wrote a letter to the Postmaster General in 1886, asking that the name be changed of this area from Farwell to Revelstoke. And he said in his letter, we propose to name our station at the second crossing of the Columbia Revelstoke, so called after the head of the firm of Berriens, who is one of the trustees under our first mortgage. The present name of the town at this point is Farwell, called after an adventurer who squatted there. So he completely wiped out Farwell's role as a surveyor, provincial surveyor, and the fact that he had a legitimate provincial title, and just sort of branded him as a squatter and an adventurer. So the secretary of the post office department wrote back to Van Horn and said, I will undertake to make the change you ask, that is, have the Farwell post office called Revelstoke, which will have one advantage at any rate. It will give us a name, whereas the other, Farwell, amounted to nothing at all. And I did quite a detailed talk about the Farwell town site and how the whole Farwell dispute and the change of the name. And so in my first book, Rob did this cartoon. There's a fellow saying, Lord Revelstoke, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company is wondering if you'd like to invest in one of its new towns. And Revelstoke says, does it have a ski hill? And as I said, Revelstoke himself, Lord Revelstoke, never came here. He had taken the name Lord Revelstoke from his estate in Plymouth, but his great grandson was here in 2009, I believe it was, for when we had a homecoming, and James Farwell was his great grandson, who also had the title Lord Revelstoke. James has since passed away, and the title has gone down to his son Alexander. So the title of Lord Revelstoke still exists as well. And so this is the Bourne Brothers store showing the Revelstoke Station post office. It opened in 1891. Before that, there was a single post office on Front Street. And then in 1891, they opened a second one in the Bourne Brothers store, which was on the road next to the station. And so this part of town was actually called Revelstoke Station for quite a while. And the old Farwell town site was referred to as Revelstoke. And that carried on even through into the 1910s, certainly in terms of the tax rolls that we have here. Those names were still in existence. So the Selkirk Mountains, remember last time we were talking about David Thompson, and he called them Nelson's Mountains. They were renamed Selkirk Mountains after in honor of Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, who was the founder of the Red River Colony and one of the major patrons of the Hudson's Bay Company. And Illecillewaet was in that is a Xhosa name, or a name that's used in the language of the Sinaiaks people. And we believe it just means big water, or swift, fast water. Well, it's kind of random because we have names like Nakusp and Comaplex, which were indigenous names. So Sicamous, Malaqua, those are indigenous names. So some names were kept and some weren't. But it's nice to see that there are some of those original indigenous names, and of course, their original spelling and pronunciation of that was a little bit different. It would be Silwahiitqua, Itqui. So it was slightly different, but it was written and translated as Illecillewaet. And it's referred to in the journals of Walter Moberly and Mr. Turnbull, who was in Walter Moberly's exploration party. And they do make reference to the name there. We've got the Illecillewaet Dam. The original dam was built on the river in 1898 and was there until I believe about the 1980s. I have to double check the date when it was removed. And so the CPR had a real influence in terms of naming in this area. So a lot of the names have both related to the Canadian Pacific Railway and to the Dominion government of the day, because the CPR wasn't quite a crown corporation, but they were certainly sort of embedded with the government. They were sort of the building the railway was kind of at the bidding of the government. They were very entwined. So a lot of the naming that happened in this area is really reflective of that history. So we've got Mount Sir Donald, which was named in 1887 by an order in council. It was originally called Syndicate Mountain, referring to the whole CPR syndicate of owners, but it was changed to honor Donald Alexander Smith. It was later known as Lord Strathcona, and he was the principal director in the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, and is the one who drove the last spike at Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885. Mount Mackenzie and Mackenzie Avenue are both named after the Right Honorable Alexander Mackenzie, 1882 to 1892, who was Canada's second prime minister. I know people sometimes think it's after Alexander Mackenzie the explorer, as in Mackenzie River fame, but it was a different Alexander Mackenzie. So he was the second prime minister, and he was actually a stonemason. And I don't just mean in terms of belonging to the Order of Stonemasons or Masonry. He was a stonemason. One of the projects that he worked on was the Welland Canal. He also did several historic buildings that are still standing in Ontario and Quebec. So, and Mackenzie Avenue has been spelled so many different ways. I think I saw in one phone book, and this was probably in the 80s, one Revelstoke phone book, I saw 4 different spellings of Mackenzie. So there's MC capital K, MC small k, MAC capital K, MACK, no capital, which is the correct spelling, MACKENZIE. So, but I've even seen like street scenes or street photographs where the downtown signs actually say MCK. So even the city council or the city staff spelled it wrong all the time. So that but if you're but I correct that one all the time because it's MACK, no capital. So here's some backcountry skiers on Mount Mackenzie. I believe there's some McRae's in that group. So they were, this was long before there was organized skiing on Mount Mackenzie. The first ski hill went in there in 1963. Paul Mayer started and his partner started the original ski hill on Mount Mackenzie, opened it in December of 1963. Of course, we're just using the lower slopes of the mountain at the time. And Mount Cartier sort of also reflects that Dominion history. A lot of people think it's after the explorer Jacques Cartier, but it's actually named after George Etienne Cartier, who 1814 to 1873, who was Attorney General for Lower Canada, and before the Dominion of Canada was formed in 1856. He was a joint prime minister with Sir John A. Macdonald and was a strong advocate of Confederation. Upon the creation of Canada in 1867, when John A. Macdonald became the first prime minister, George Etienne Cartier was Minister of Militia and Defense. So that's who that mountain is named after. The lookout tower up there was built in 1924. And I added this photograph in because it's quite dramatic. Unfortunately, because of my Zoom screen here, you can't see, but the lookout tower is on the very top of that photograph. But look right here. There's a tent at the base of the final approach, and it's Warden Sam Desimone and Roy McMahon right there. So it's a very dramatic photograph. And then, of course, the community of Mount Cartier was developed at the foot of the mountain. And I think it was in the 1920s that the name of Mount Cartier was formally adopted as the name of the community. And the post office was named the Mount Cartier Post Office. But yeah, you can see it's quite a large community. There's even a church there. They had for a while, they did have a school, a cemetery, post office. And it was largely Ukrainian and Polish settlers who were settled there. Mount McPherson is named after Sir David McPherson, who was also known as one of the fathers of the Confederation, along with those, with the others that I'd mentioned, Cartier, and so a lot of those designations were given in the 1880s, when this was still very much, part of that CPR, and that the whole Dominion government was, really part of, how this town had developed. It's a nice photograph taken from Mount Revelstoke around 1960. I believe this is a Dickey photograph. And you can see Campbell Avenue, which I'll be talking about a little later, and Mackenzie Avenue. And you can see how much land there was there before the dam was put in Castlegar in the 1960s. Yeah. And so at the base of Mount McPherson, there was a little farming community as well. There was families like the Threatfuls and the Cloughs and the Lindburns that were living there. And this is the Clough farm at the base of Mount McPherson around the 1930s. Tregallicky was named by the CPR, and it's from Scots Gaelic, meaning stand fast. So it was named as part of the CPR's control. Most of the directors, original directors of the CPR, were from Scotland originally, so that was sort of the culture that they were bringing into, and which is included in a lot of the place names in this area. And another name that a lot of people think is an Indigenous name, but again, it's a Scottish name, is Clachnacudin, which is part of the range in Mount Revelstoke National Park. And it's got that very odd spelling with two N's at the end, Clachnacudin. And it means stones of tubs, which was a feature in Inverness in northern Scotland. Okay. Now we get to Mount Begbie, and the Begbie has sort of invited quite a bit of censure lately. And there's no question he was part of the colonial structure of the time, and some of his individual actions and his actions as part of the government certainly caused harm. One of the things that a lot of people note about him is that he was the judge who sentenced the Chilcotin chiefs to be hanged as part of the end of the Chilcotin War during the sort of the road building in the Caribou. I won't get into all the details of that, but because of the road builders and the way that they were mistreating the Chilcotin people, the chiefs declared war on the road builders, and there were several people who died as a result of that. And these chiefs thought that they were going into a meeting, sort of a treaty meeting, and ended up just being charged and executed. And Begbie was in charge of those trials. Begbie himself, he was an interesting person. He had come to British Columbia in 1858, right at the time that Revelstoke became a crown colony, and he and James Douglas actually swore each other in as part of when they declared British Columbia crown colony. And so he was really part of that colonial government. He was an imposing person. He was 6'5", and a lot of people say that he was called a hanging judge after his death, but he was aware of that, being called that during his lifetime, and said that it wasn't he who did the hanging, it was the juries, because he didn't have a lot of leeway in terms of sentencing if there was a first-degree murder charge against somebody. But he said he actively cultivated the reputation for being stern and harsh, because they were dealing with a lot of sort of miners who'd come up from the States and were sort of flooding into the interior. So he felt that he was justified in sort of cultivating that reputation. But he was also a cultured man. He was an artist, a choir singer, mathematician, a gardener, a cartographer. He learned quite a few of the Indigenous languages, especially in the interior. And he brought forth some legislation that gave rights to Indigenous women, and also called for the recognition of Indigenous land rights. But you can't escape the fact that the majority of the people that he sentenced to death were Indigenous men. He was in Revelstoke only once that we've been able to determine, in June of 1885, and came here to, it said it was mostly appeals from convictions in liquor selling cases. And as you've heard me talk before, liquor sales was a big deal in this area. There's big battles between the Dominion and provincial governments. But the mountain itself was, it shows up under the name Mount Begbie in an 1890 map of West Kootenay, published by the Geological Survey of Canada and drawn by the George Dawson. And the name was officially adopted on June 30th, 1900, which was after Begbie's death. He died in 1894. There's a good view of Begbie just coming up the hill. And in this photograph, it was referred to as Moran Hill. There was a family named Moran who had a farm just at the base of the hill. So this is what is would now be, the road up to Arrow Heights Airport Way. I'm not sure if it's the same, if it's in exactly the same place, or if it was rebuilt at some point. But it's basically a road, going up to Arrow Heights.
And curvature.
What's the general opinion here? Do you think it's pretty much the same as current Airport Way?
Modified.
And somebody's parked their carriage on the side there. Yeah, this picture is taken about 1912, and so yeah, there was some power up there. Yeah. Mount Copeland is an interesting one. Of course, Mount Copeland is north of town, and the name was adopted in 1909 in Ottawa, and it was named after, again, a man who never came here. It was Professor Ralph Copeland, who was the Royal Astronomer for Scotland for several years. He was he lived until 1905, and his was as I said, the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, and he discovered 35 new objects, which are recorded, space objects, and it said 7 of the galaxies in Leo form the what's known as the Copeland Septet, named after him. One of his children, Richard Ralph Copeland, was born in Germany, where Copeland was studying in 1866. And Richard Copeland came out to Revelstoke around 1892 and worked in the CPR shops. Later went into business for himself as a carpenter and cabinet maker. He was also quite a well-known artist in town, and he did the backdrop of the Opera House. But he was also a climber. He was a charter member of the Canadian Alpine Club, and in August of 1908, along with Harry Siegfried, made the first recorded ascent of Mount Copeland, and they erected a stone cairn there. And he applied to have it named after his father. So that's where the name Mount Copeland gets its name. These photographs were of a molybdenum mine that was located on Mount Copeland in the 1970s. If you look up the highest snowfall in Canada, you'll see it recorded as snowfall on Mount Copeland in 1972. And there might have been higher snowfalls, but there was actually people up there at the time, and working in the mine, so they were able to record the snowfall. And I can't remember what the inches were, but that was the year that Revelstoke town got its record snowfall, 315 inches. Now going down south into the Arrowhead, and start with the name Incomaplex, which came from an Excelson or a word from the Sinaiax people, pronounced Incomapalux, and it means head of the lake. So the Incomaplex is pretty much the head of the upper Arrow Lake, and some of the early work in terms of talking to Sinaiax people who's were in that area. There was a woman named Nancy Winecoop who was interviewed by some of the early ethnographers, and she referred to Incomaplex as one of the early, or she referred to it as the earliest settlement of the Sinaiax people. So it certainly goes way back in time in terms of Sinaiax settlement. It was also referred to as Fish Creek. And then the Arrow Lakes, there's, again, there's one story that on the east side of Lower Arrow Lake, there was what was known as Arrow Rock, where there were three large crevices about 40 feet above the water, and they'd found hundreds of embedded arrows in there. And it was believed that that was an area where the Sinaiac hunters would do practice and using it for target practice, basically. Um, there's a few different stories about how that got its name, but the two long, narrow lakes between Arrowhead and just north of Castlegar were referred to as the Upper and Lower Arrow Lakes. And of course, now with the expanded reservoir that extends all the way up to Revelstoke is known as the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. And Arrowhead itself had the indigenous name for that area was Kuspitsu, which means buffalo hide. Would have reflected some of the trading that they would have done with other nations. But the name Arrowhead was officially adopted in 1895, basically because it was at the head of the Arrow Lakes, at the Upper Arrow Lake, and it was actually named by the CPR, who built a branch line from Revelstoke to Arrowhead. The branch line was in construction for a few years. They didn't complete it until 1895, and that's when the town site itself really took off. There was a Lakeview Hotel, which was one of the first hotels in Arrowhead, and then the town developed from there. And of course, there were a couple of large sawmills in the area. And Beaton was originally named Thompson's Landing after a man named J.W. Thompson. And he'd come to Revelstoke as the first school teacher in 1889, and then started doing a little bit of exploring south of Revelstoke, and ended up establishing this little community along with his partner, who was Malcolm Beaton. And that was the Thompson's Landing post office opened in 1895, but we have record of them being there in as early as 1892. But they had Thompson's Landing with the initials TL and Trout Lake with the initials of TL. So the post office department insisted that one of them be changed. So the name of Thompson's Landing was changed to Beaton. And the post office closed there in August of 1969, which was probably quite a while after, because the reservoir had already been filled by then. So there was probably no post office to close even by that time.
Looks like they're having a flood in Might be figuring on the water.
Oh, yeah.
The previous picture was low water.
I think these. Yeah, I think these are actually photographs that originally came from the collection of Matty Gunterman. They're in the collection of the Vancouver Public Library. That's where we got the copies from, and they have a lot of the Gunterman photographs. You can see there's some commercial buildings down in this area too. But you're right, that definitely looks like high water, and it could be one of the mills on the other side. Well, it wouldn't be Arrowhead. There was a Comiplex mill. Yeah. Now we'll get on to up to Mount Revelstoke. People in town started really exploring Mount Revelstoke in the early 1900s, and A.E. Miller, who was the principal of Central School, which opened in 1903, and then he became the school superintendent for this area. And he did a lot of hiking up there. He went up with Dan McIntosh, who was Rowena Meehan's father. And Dan McIntosh was a hunter and trapper and miner in this area. So even though McIntosh doesn't really get the credit, he was probably the first of the local settlers to have gone up onto Mount Revelstoke. But and it's in some accounts said that he's the one that showed Miller Lake to Miller, but the end Lake ended up being named after Miller. We have a lot of photographs of the lake and that whole area by Emma Roberts, who lived here in the late teens and early 20s. And she and her daughters spent a lot of time up on Mount Revelstoke. So we have quite a few photographs of the area from her collection. And then Eva Lake was named after Eva Hobbs Parker. And Eva Hobbs is the woman on the left, the one who's wearing pants and carrying an axe. So I don't think you want to mess with her. She was actually a charter member of the Alpine Club of Canada and participated in the Alpine Club's first camp at Yoho in, I think it was 1907. And so she was, they had a Revelstoke branch of the Alpine Club as well, Revelstoke Mountaineering Club, and she was a member of that as well. And they were building, there was a group of them building the first chalet in 1909. And after they were doing work on the chalet, some of them wanted to go for a hike. And they hiked into Miller Lake, which had already been, people already knew about at that time. And then they continued on farther. And Eva, apparently, according to her recollections, was getting a little bit annoyed that some of the other women were quite slow and they were getting the boys to hold their hands after the rough spots. And she was a little bit disgusted with that. So she went on ahead and saw this other lake and came back and said, I just saw another lake. And they didn't believe her. So they followed her in. And that's when Eva Lake was noted and ended up being named after her. And she said, that's, she'd much rather have that than her name on a tombstone. And there again, there's Eva on the left. There's also, it's not really a term that's used too much, but a lot of the early notes about Mount Revelstoke were referring to McDonald's Bluff, which was described as the highest point of the park that you could see from land. So basically, what the sort of the ridge that we see from town. And it was named after C.R. MacDonald, who along with Miller and McIntosh was one of the early hikers in the area. And he had the McDonald's drugstore, which is where a taco club is now. And there he is out on a picnic. That their picnic bag actually says C.R. MacDonald drugstore on it. And the couple on the right are Dr. Hamilton and his wife, and Hamilton Creek is named after Dr. Hamilton. And it's just a great photo, so I wanted to include that one too. And then, of course, we've got Williamson's Lake, which has really been a part of the community for a long time. And it was named after Albert Williamson, who was a farmer in that area in the 1890s. And it's kind of interesting that the creeks are named on there. There's Collings Creek, Yates Creek, and Ramsey's Creek. So the one coming in from the other side of where the beach area is was originally known as Yates Creek. There was a man named Yates who had a farm in that area. And then at the south end, there was the farm known as Ramsey family had a farm down at that end. I haven't been able to figure out where the Collins Creek name came from, though. There's also Hayes Creek that's mentioned up here. The Hayes were an early family that had a farm in that area. So Hay Road, of course, is named after them. And it wasn't named after Hay the crop, it was named after Hay the family. And here's a good aerial view showing Williamson's Lake. Some of the Still Dickey photographs, probably in the 1960s. And you can see the lake and how it's developed with the dock and the diving structure. And then you can see there's a little pond a little bit south of it as well. So Big Eddy is basically named because there was a big eddy there. It was a big river eddy. And the sort of, when you're go across and you're heading up towards the dump, sort of that, where it sort of takes that big sort of turn into the bank. There was, quite a treacherous river eddy, and it was noted by some of the early explorers and fur traders in the area as a treacherous piece of water to watch for. And see notes of when there was a sawmill in that area, and they had to be careful that the eddy didn't take out their booms of logs. Walter Nelson and Bob Blackmore are seen here booming logs in the Big Eddy. Bob Blackmore was a really noted riverboatman in the area. This picture was taken in June of 1920, and Walter Nelson died shortly after this picture was taken. He was in a boating accident. He was just 20 years old at the time. And he had three young women in the boat with him, and they hit there's the stones or the dikes out from Front Street, and the water was quite high, and he thought he could sort of get some air and go over it, but he sort of hit the edge, and the boat overturned, and all four of them were drowned. Now, on to Columbia Park. It actually was a parkland that was granted to the city by the Dominion government in 1899. And so there were a lot of picnics held there. In 1908, the racetrack was built there by what was known as the Revelstoke Turf Club. And then they had their horse races and fall fairs at that area. And in fact, the golf club house that's there now was built as the agricultural hall in 1912. And then it became the golf course in 1924. A lot of the area was farmland. So a lot of the names in Columbia Park reflect some of the farmers that were there. The Laforme Boulevard was after George Laforme, who had a farm, but he also was a really well-known mining packer into the Big Bend area. There's a picture of his pack train in 1894. There was Jock Malcolm, who his land is now part of the golf course. So a lot of the other names out there, the street names, Allen Road after Oliver Henry Allen, who had a brewery in Columbia Park. Smythe Road after Hugh Smythe and his family. His oldest daughter was Marjorie Kelly Parker, who was well known in town. Cleland after early police chief James Cleland. And it was one of his daughters that died in that boat accident that I just mentioned. Mary Hanson, named after the mother of Greta Spearbrecker, family that came there quite early. And Maddox, Bernard Nelson was a really well-known local person who really well respected. So Bernard Nelson Crescent was named after him. But a lot of those names reflect sort of that early agricultural history in Columbia Park. Now we get back down onto Front Street, and I'd mentioned that first, second, and third were originally John, James, and George Streets. And then we've got Douglas, which was probably after James Douglas, the first governor of the Crown Colony of BC. But I don't know who Charles was. So a lot of those names have kind of been lost in history. We don't know who Wilson was. Wright, we're pretty sure, was Gustavus Blinwright, who was a road builder. He built the tote road between what's now Sycamoose and what's now Revelstoke, and built a little toll bridge across the river in by 1885. And he had a little sawmill and store on the west bank of the river. So we're pretty sure that's where Wright Street comes from. And Benson and Hanson were early hotel owners. Whale Street is named after, in recognition of J.A. Mera, who he was one of the members, or one of the owners of the Columbia Kootenai Steam Navigation Company that built a lot of the early steamboats in this area. And they were given a land grant in that area. So Mera was kind of in control of that. His name shows up in the tax records until those lots were sold to individual owners. So he was originally from Wales himself. So we believe that's where Wales Street comes from. And there's again a picture of Douglas Street. And you can see this house is still there. That was the first hospital in town, a private hospital, and it's now just a private residence. It's interesting to see, a little bit of a bridge there. There was a bit of a gully, and a blacksmith shop right at the foot that's no longer there. So now there was an interesting, little piece of Revelstoke history. There was a land grant given to a company called the Revelstoke Smelting and Trading Company in 1890. And their idea was to build a smelter here, and they actually did build it, but it was only in operation for a very short period of time. And eventually, because of erosion on the bank, it slid into the river. So this is a map um, of the subdivision that was granted to the Revelstoke Smelting and Trading Company, and it was drawn in 1890. And I'd have to, I actually did a comparison of sort of a current map, and you can see how much land was gone. So there's quite, like, this little section is gone, and all of this is gone. So this whole area where the smelter was is just eroded into the river. So there was quite a bit of land that was lost to erosion there. But this accounts for a lot of the street names in that area. So the first street in there is interesting. It's called Garden Avenue, which is just a nice sounding name. But the surveyor who prepared the map is named J.F. Garden. So he probably just decided he was going to throw his own name into this map. But all of the other names, we've got Rokeby, Boyle, and Campbell. Those were all directors of the smelting company. And then there was Orton and MacArthur, who were there. Those streets are outside of their grant, but those are also directors. So that's where those names come from. Connaught Avenue came after the Duke of Connaught, who was Governor General of Canada and one of the sons of Queen Victoria. And of course, Victoria Road was named after Queen Victoria herself. There's Campbell Avenue, taken in the 1960s when it still had the spur track running along it. That was taken out in 1972. That was the McGregor's, now Grizz Hotel. Robson Street, I don't think I have a picture of that one, but well, this one is showing sort of Orton to Boyle, and be about 1908, because the Bank of Commerce isn't in this picture yet, but the what's the clinic building, Conversations building is there. So it'd be around 1908, 1909. And you can see Campbell Avenue there with the spur track on it, and Mackenzie and Orton. So it's, and the rink there where Coal River Manor Apartments is now. So Robson Street was named after the 9th Premier of BC, John Robson. And there was an interesting story where he was doing a campaign trip in 1890, and a couple of the miners in town, including J.M. Kelly, who went on to become an MLA, kind of kidnapped Premier Robson and took him to a public meeting and kind of pilloried him over his mining legislation. And he said, well, if you're that concerned, why don't you elect a mining man? So that's where J.M. Kelly ended up being elected as our MLA for this area. That's another whole story. Vernon Avenue was named after Forbes George Vernon, who was the person that was responsible for the establishment of Vernon. He had the Coldstream Ranch there, and the town of Vernon was named after him. When you go into Southside, you see names like Temple, Taylor, Sibbald, and Downey. Those are all railway names. They're all men who were involved with the railway at the time. Downey was actually named. We've got a Downey in the Big Bend, Downey Creek, which was named after William Downey, who was a miner in the Big Bend gold rush of the 1860s. And then we've got Downey Street and Downey Slide, which were after a different Downey, but same spelling. So the Thomas Downey was can't remember if he was the master mechanic or what his position was, but he was fairly high up in the local division in Revelstoke. And he was killed in a slide at Downey. It was him and another man, a man named Dodds, who were killed in that slide. And it's been a recurring slide path. There's been several deaths there since then, and it slid last year as well, but there weren't any, there weren't any deaths or major damage associated with it. But that's where Downey Street gets its name from as well. Some of the other streets we don't really know, like I don't know who Oscar was or Humbert or some of the others. So there's quite a few sort of those names have been kind of lost to history. But there's some interesting stories behind them as well. So that's about it for this talk. And the next talk was going to be on the Winter Games in 1983, but I changed my mind. So we're going to do mining in the Lardo instead, which I think is probably more interesting to a lot of people. So thank you for joining us. And just stop.